Most scientists would like us to believe that science is rational and predictable and sequential, and we have very strict laboratory experiments that have to absolutely prove something before we say it's true. We know, however, that's not true. The reason we became the most intelligent and most powerful animals on this planet is because of our ability to collaborate. We couldn't be living in villages, towns, and cities if there wasn't this huge collaboration. We wouldn't have agriculture. We'd still be hunter-gatherers if it wasn't for our ability to collaborate. At its core, nature is collaborative. The left hemisphere of our brain is incredibly intelligent. It's great at analyzing things. It's great at breaking things down into smaller parts and understanding them mechanistically. But it isn't empathic. The left hemisphere of our brain does not share. It's the right hemisphere of our brain, which is physically larger and wired in a much more complex way, which gives us the ability to be empathic, not just to our family members or our neighbors, but to other people we don't even know. And if we didn't have that ability, we wouldn't have agriculture, we wouldn't have towns, we wouldn't have cities. And we're going to have to accelerate that part of our thinking and understanding if we're going to thrive during the next 50 years.
Joining us today is Doug Grunther. He is the author of his newly released book titled The Quantum and the Dream, Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance. So we want to welcome you to the show, Doug. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be on the ethereal edge. Looking forward to it.
I love that. I love the little plug right in the beginning. That's great.
Well, it's a provocative title, and it certainly reflects a lot of what I've written about in my book.
We agree. And that's what drew us to you as well. And I was just going to say, everything that's titled in your book, I mean, we want to cover all those topics because those are all the things we love to talk about. We're fascinated by them. Consciousness, philosophy, quantum physics, you kind of cover all the bases. So I think we could have a very long conversation, but I'm excited to dive in. And just before we kind of get started with everything, I did want to ask you, because you've obviously done your homework on all of these subjects. So how did you get started with all of this? Like, where did this enter into your life and become something so important for you?
Well, of course, like many questions, there's a long and short answer. I'll try to go medium. The first inspiration really was over 50 years ago when I was a sophomore in college and my mind was being opened up by a really dynamic philosophy professor. And I used to, because I wasn't that well read at the time, I loved to go to the Columbia College bookstores and just let my eyes roam around all these amazing books. And I would pick one out at random and read the first page. And two of the books really made an impact on me right away. They were both very narrow books. One was the Tao Ching, the famous Taoist book of wisdom, which has endured for thousands of years. The other was a contemporary book by the media philosopher Marshall McLuhan, who was the most sought after intellectual visionary in the 1960s. His book was called The Medium is the Message. They were both thin books. And I had the same reaction, a paradoxical one, reading them both. I knew reading one page that these were going to be two of the most important books I've ever read, and I didn't understand what the heck they were talking about. So you say, well, how can those two things be true? And what I realize now, 50 years later, is that's the difference between the left hemisphere of our brain and the right hemisphere, where the left hemisphere tries to analyze and figure things out in a sequential, rational way. But it's our right hemisphere which intuitively understands something at a deep level, even though it can't explain all that it's receiving. And those two books sort of got me started. And in my book I just published, among the references I make are to the Tao Ching and to Marshall McLuhan's book. So it really kind of started then. As far as the quantum and the dream, the title, I'm not a scientist. I'm not very good at math. But I read a book called The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra. Maybe some of your listeners are familiar with that book. It came out in 1975. It was reissued in the year 2000 because it was still so popular. And this book literally blew my mind because here was a physicist who had a mystical experience and then went and did research and discovered that four of the leading founders of quantum theory, the most successful scientific theory of all time, and one of the most mysterious, the four of the leading founders were all very seriously passionate about ancient Eastern wisdom traditions like the Tao Ching, like Zen, like Buddhist, like Hindu mythology. And he realized that can't just be a coincidence. There's got to be some interesting connection between his mystical experience and his love of quantum theory and the fact that so many of the leading quantum figures were just as interested in the mystical and the spiritual. So that got me started being interested not in the science of quantum physics. Richard Feynman, who got a Nobel Prize for his work in quantum physics, famously said, anyone who says they understand quantum physics doesn't. So when quantum scientists start sounding like Zen masters, you know we're into something pretty interesting. As far as dreams go, around that same time in the mid-1980s, I was experiencing some strange medical symptoms. About once a week, I was too exhausted to get out of bed. So I figured could be Lyme's disease, could be mono. So I had a full blood test, and my doctor says, blood is excellent. I said, well, something's wrong. A friend of mine was a famous allergist in the area, and he said, sounds like an allergy. I'll give you the best test I have. And the results came in, and he says, I know this sounds crazy. I know it's not true, but according to the test, you're allergic to everything. So he said, I can't help you. So I left his office really frustrated, right? I mean, what's going on? And my intuition said, go to a bookstore and find a book, just like I had done at the Columbia bookstore. And the book that kind of intrigued me going through the psychology section was a book called Dreamwork by Dr. Jeremy Taylor. Long story short, I read that book cover to cover. I started practicing some of the easy techniques for remembering and more dreams and tuning into the message of your dreams. And within a month, my symptoms disappeared. So that got me started. And that gives a little kind of background as to where the quantum and the dream comes from.
I have always been really curious about dreams and how they relate to reality. And I know in your book, you talk about Einstein's work with dreams. I have this recurring dream. I have like a couple of them that literally I've had since I was little. And I would love to know or hear more about Einstein's work with dreams and what your thoughts are on that.
I would be happy to tell you about Einstein's dream. He didn't really work with dreams as much as he is quoted as saying, and I authenticated all the quotes I use in my book. He said, my entire career is influenced by a dream I had when I was 11 years old. So I'll go into that. But Tracy, if we have time, I'd be happy to talk about your recurring dreams, because recurring dreams, if they're recurring, they have something to say to us now, even if they started when we were kids. Because in the dream world, here's the affinity between the dream world and the quantum world. There's no past, present, or future at either level. There is only a non-material presence. And that's been proven at the quantum theory of existence. And both my dream teachers confirmed that. And we know that through our dreams. You know, past, present, and future, they all get intermingled together. Now, in Einstein's case, here's perhaps the most famous scientist of the 20th century. And we like to think of scientists, and quite frankly, most scientists would like us to believe that science is rational and predictable and sequential, and we have very strict laboratory experiments that have to absolutely prove something before we say it's true. We know, however, that's not true. How do we know that? Albert Einstein, considered the greatest scientist of the 20th century, credits two experiences. We now know they operate in the right hemisphere of our brain, which we can talk more about because we all have access to it. Let's talk about the fact that he said his entire career is based on a dream he had when he was 11 years old. It was a simple dream. In his dream at 11, he's on a sled. He's going down this steep slope, and he keeps picking up more and more and more speed until the sky starts refracting into tremendous colors. Now, he didn't know what that meant, but it stuck with him that there's got to be a relationship between speed and light. And of course, that's what the theory of relativity is about. Now, he also loved to conduct what he called thought experiments. And some people refer to it now as creative visualization, something we can all do, where he would sit at his desk and imagine something interesting. And in the particular case, he imagined that what would happen if he chased a light beam? So in his imagination, he visualized himself chasing a light beam. And in his imagination, when he caught up with the light beam, time stopped. And that gave him an intuitive sense. Well, maybe nothing can go faster than the speed of light. And maybe at the speed of light, there's only presence. So the dream and his thought experiment were huge influences on why he was the first one to discover the theory of relativity, and not the scientists who were working in prestigious universities, scientists who are working in the most well-equipped laboratories. Albert Einstein is a great example of somebody who did his work in the laboratory of his inner creative mind, which we now know is where our creative unconscious connects with the right hemisphere of our brain. We know that now because we have EEG and MRI technologies, which can actually image the brain as things are happening. Yes, a lot of great science gets done through laboratory equipment and testing and confirmation of experiments. But a lot of great science, including a lot of the great quantum science, was done much more on the intuitional level.
I would agree with that, Doug. I think it sounds like he gave himself permission to use his creativity to tap into a greater wealth of knowledge that we all have access to, right? I mean, this is just out in the ether. We just have to put our attention and our focus on it. And going back to the dreams, it's interesting because I've actually taken a dream class myself. And this was several years ago. And I was at the time training for a marathon. And I took this dream to the class to explain what it was and see if anybody could help figure it out. But basically, I showed up at the finish line 3 hours before the race even started. And I couldn't figure out where anybody was. I was just like sitting there fully in my gear, ready to go. And I'm like, where is everybody? It was like 4 a.m., nobody to be seen on the streets. And anyway, I got a lot of feedback on what that probably meant. But it is interesting. And I always love looking more deeply into these types of concepts. And I know that you also share more about synchronicity in your book. And that's always been a fascinating topic for me, because I think we've all had that experience where we look at the clock throughout the day and we see 11:11 or 3:33, right? Or you think of a friend and the next thing you know, they're texting you or they're calling you. So can you expand a little bit more on your thoughts about synchronicity and what that means?
One of the most fascinating aspects of being a human being is experiencing these synchronicities. And as you point out, Tara, we've all experienced them. Some of them are kind of like smiles from the universe, where you're thinking of someone you haven't talked to a long time and they suddenly text you within the next day. All right. Did our thinking about them cause them to text us? Probably not. Was it a pure coincidence? Maybe, but it feels too meaningful to just be a coincidence. So what is that reality between a pure coincidence and us causing something? Well, this was intriguing the man who became the most influential psychologist of the 20th century, Carl Jung. And he's the one who coined the word synchronicity, referring, as you correctly state, to two or more events that clearly didn't cause each other, but are too meaningfully connected to just be a coincidence. And it started because of an experience he had, which I relate in my book, but some of your viewers and listeners may be familiar with it because Jung talked about it in his autobiography. So we know it's what happened, and it's really cool. So Jung started by working at the side of Sigmund Freud and learned a lot from Freud, but actually surpassed Freud in his expansive understanding of the unconscious. And he was gaining in the 1920s a reputation as being one of the most successful psychoanalysts and therapists in Europe. And so he had a thriving practice, but he had one client, an aristocratic woman, he couldn't get anywhere with, no matter what techniques he used. And he had very powerful techniques and understandings. She kept resisting. And he felt it was his responsibility. He just couldn't get anywhere. And so he decided, in fairness, that when she came for her next session, he would say to her, "We tried hard, but it's not working, so I recommend we stop." So she comes in for what he anticipated to be the last session. And here's what happens. She's relating a dream she had where she's in ancient Egypt. And she's presented with this magical ring in the shape of a scarab beetle. The scarab beetle was a revered image in ancient Egyptian mythology. And as she's relating this dream to Jung, Jung hears a tapping on the window of his office. And he goes over, and there's an insect banging against the window. He opens the window, and he's able to grab it. And it's a beetle. And it's a beetle that is most resembling of a scarab beetle in Europe. And he walks over to the woman, opens his hand, and says, "Madam, here's your beetle, your dream beetle." She was so flipped out by this that her resistance melted, and they had an excellent session and continued until she was considered cured. So that struck Jung as pretty exciting, and he spent the rest of his career contemplating, thinking about, conversing about, and writing about the experience of synchronicity. And in fact, and this was some of my favorite research for my book, for over 2 decades, Carl Jung was in constant communication and had meetings 3 or 4 times a year with one of the most renowned quantum theorists in the world, Wolfgang Pauli, who received a Nobel Prize in quantum theory. And who nominated him for his Nobel Prize? Albert Einstein. Looks pretty good on your resume. Pauli was a constant dreamer, and he had a lot of emotional issues in his life. And so he sought out Carl Jung to help him with his dreams. Carl Jung would pick Pauli's brain because he was fascinated by synchronicity and quantum theory. And the two of them were convinced that there was a direct pathway between the creative unconscious of the human mind and the quantum reality of the universe. They were never able to prove it, but they spent hours and hours discussing it with the help of good wine, Cuban cigars. But they were convinced, and they're not the only ones. So there are many of us who feel that there is this intimate connection, and they all have to do with the right hemisphere of our brain. And we can talk about what the distinction between the left and right hemispheres are, and some of the theories as to why evolution gave us these kinds of brains to work and play with.
Speaking of evolution, technology has evolved immensely at a crazy rate. And in your book, you have a nice section. You talk about AI, and I am a huge fan of anything AI technology. I want my own robot. I'm on the list for Tesla, mostly just to follow me around and pick things up. But you have some specific thoughts on how AI is affecting society. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, it's a complex question, and we'll love to get into it, because most of the people I talk to, including some of the brightest people I've interviewed and some of my favorite friends, are absolutely anxiety ridden over AI, which is understandable. It's having a huge effect on us, and we're projecting a lot of negative things on it, some of which are potentially real and some of which are just apocalyptic, because that's who we are as humans. We like to create drama. I'll kind of give you my punchline over the whole thing and then go to some of the evidence which brings me to it. Marshall McLuhan, I mentioned when I opened his book 50 years ago, I knew this is a guy I had to understand, and I still think about him today because he was speaking to us. He died in 1980, the first year of the first personal computer. But a lot of the men and women who were tinkering around with computers in their garages in the 70s, right, like Steve Jobs and Wozniak and Gates and all those people, they were in constant communication with McLuhan because he understood what was going on with media. And as what he pointed out was, if you look at the history of all major media inventions throughout human evolution, they all initially create huge anxiety and dislocation. Okay. So, in some senses, AI that you and I really revere is very new and unprecedented, but in many ways, the anxiety that it's generating has been true throughout history. I'll give an example. When TV came out, I quote some of the critics, "This is going to rot children's brains." Well, you know what? They weren't totally wrong, because as a 6-year-old in front of that TV, what were they advertising to me? Sugar, sugar, and sugar. Cereals laden with sugar, candy bars laden with sugar. These brilliant commercials with chocolate dripping down from the sky. So I was screaming for sugar all day long. And it took me as an adult to get off my addiction to sugar. Okay. But I think we'd agree that through TV, we became much more collaborative as a nation. It connected us in new ways. It ended the Vietnam War. The event that's given most credit for ending the Vietnam War, it took decades, was a TV image of that little that little Vietnamese girl running naked from her village, which was blowing up with napalm. That image did more to stop the Vietnam War than anything. When the printing press was invented, who could be against the printing press? Read some of the top intellectuals writing at that time in the 15th century. They were apoplectic. They said, this is going to kill conversation. People are going to be stuck with these things in their face, and they're not going to pay attention to anything else. Plus, there's going to be too much information. People's brains are going to get totally confused. Well, they weren't wrong. Too much information does confuse our brains, but not enough information keeps us ignorant, and ignorance is not bliss. So we could go down to every major invention: radio, phonograph, the motion picture projector. They all created huge anxieties because, as McLuhan showed, a new medium rewires the human brain on an unconscious level. So us baby boomers who grew up with TV found TV natural. Our parents didn't, because they didn't grow up with it. Just like their parents didn't grow up with radio. And with the World Wide Web, the most collaborative medium by far we've ever created, it's creating huge anxiety because it's rewiring our brains. It's forcing our brains to act a little faster, because what people don't realize, we go back to McLuhan, when we're reading something, let's say an article on our digital screen, we're not reading print. Print is a material ink that sits on a page and doesn't move. What we're reading on a digital screen are vibrating pixels, which are actually, and I make a case for this, and I have footnotes and everything, when we're on the World Wide Web, the vibrating pixels of both images and words are closer in sync with the way our brains generate new ideas than is print. But it takes time to adjust. And you know, anyone who has younger kids, grandkids knows it's much more natural for them than it is for us, because their brains are more acclimated to work at the faster pace. What's crucial now, because any good thing taken to an extreme becomes a problem. And we know that there's a terrible addiction to social media and the digital screen, just as I got addicted to the TV screen when I was 6 years old. So it's very important that we get off the screen and learn to slow our brain waves down. That's what contemplation, meditation, thought experiments that Einstein did, which are available to all of us. That's the slowing down of our brain waves. Very important. When we're on the screen, we need to speed up our brains because, and this is one of my punchlines, the most famous historian on the planet right now is Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*. And what is the key thesis of *Sapiens*? The reason we became the most intelligent and most powerful animals on this planet is because of our ability to collaborate. We couldn't be living in villages, towns, and cities if there wasn't this huge collaboration. We wouldn't have agriculture. We'd still be hunter-gatherers if it wasn't for our ability to collaborate. And you and I are talking over the most collaborative medium ever invented. It's creating a lot of anxiety because, like every new medium, it takes time to adjust to it. But my point in my book is, if we can't get to the new Renaissance with the most collaborative medium of all time, that's not AI's fault, that's our fault. And I think we're going to get there.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And also, Doug, I was just going to mention, I think as a society, we are very fearful of change and we're very suspicious at first of it, and we're not sure how to work with it. So I think what's happening with AI is we're looking at it through a lens of negativity as opposed to what can it do to help us and how can we work with it? And that's the other thing that I think this doesn't get brought up in these conversations enough is what exactly is AI in terms of is it sentient? Will it become sentient if it's not already? And I think that's an important conversation because there have been television shows, and of course they're more sci-fi based, but I think there's also a kernel of truth in these stories where there are robots that become sentient. And if that is true, then we do need to learn how to work with it and be also respectful in a way of it, which is what would drop the fear and allow us to actually collaborate, to your point, of working with it. And it would be for our benefit. Like Tracy said, she'd love to have a robot, to help her clean the house. Well, is that considered slavery? I know these are just thoughts I have about this topic because I think it is important to discuss that.
It's important to discuss it, absolutely, because what I like to try to do, because it's easy to ratchet up anxiety. Okay, it's easy to do. And some anxiety is required. We should be somewhat anxious about this form of intelligence because it's something new we haven't encountered before. So I agree with you, Tara, that we have to be very aware of its potential cataclysmic negative effects. Okay. But what I see mostly happening is a process which I learned through dreamwork called projection. And it's what we humans do, whether we know it or not. We don't see reality for what it is. We project onto it what we think it is. That's how our brains work. We can't avoid it. And so it's very helpful to at least recognize that we're projecting. And I feel that a lot of the anxiety around AI, while they are very legitimate questions, and in my book, I don't shirk away from the potential negative effects of AI. I quote people who are very negative on AI. But the fact of the matter is we project onto AI who we are. So let's just be honest for a second. Who are we, Homo sapiens? We're the most powerful, intelligent creatures on the planet. We've done amazingly good things, but we've also done some horrendous things, including what we do to the animals, including the way we treat the environment, right? And I think a lot of our fear about AI, some of it's legitimate, but a lot of it is we're projecting onto AI what we do as the most powerful species, which is we allow our selfishness and our need for more and more stuff to do things that are very harmful to the environment and are having a huge effect on millions of people. And I think, to me, my punchline is we created AI. Okay, this is our child, and I believe that we need to understand it, and the only way we're going to understand it is to understand more about ourselves. I think from an evolutionary standpoint, and I'm glad you both bring up evolution, because that's the big picture we're all living in. What evolution is nature's intelligence. And anyone who doesn't understand that nature's intelligence is more powerful than our intelligence isn't paying attention. If you don't think nature's intelligence and nature's power and intelligence's power is more substantial than ours, talk to the millions of people who just got surprisingly slammed by Hurricane Helene, which was supposed to be a Category 1 hurricane, and then all of a sudden it's a Category 4. So I believe we have to say, how do we collaborate with this intelligence and understand that our inclination is to project onto it our fear that it's going to do to us what we've done to the environment. Okay. In other words, I think AI has arrived. I'm talking evolution. The reason I believe AI is here, that we created it growing as fast as it is in the 21st century, is as a mirror to force us to ask the question, what does it really mean to be a human being in the 21st century? It's not good enough anymore to simply grab more stuff for us and our family, because we're seeing what that's doing. And I'm encouraged by younger people who are getting trends like smaller houses, who are having good experience at a higher level than having more stuff. Okay. And I'm amazed at how, as an older person who was caught up in that whole materialist paradigm growing up, more is better. Nowadays, I can't wait to get rid of stuff. One of my largest intentions in writing The Quantum and the Dream was to make it feel like a trip, two parallel trips, one into the creative center of the human mind, which is the unconscious, which most psychologists don't want to talk about, right? The deep, dark unconscious, which is where our creativity, the center of our creativity is. And the other trip is into the creative darkness of the quantum realm, which is a fascinating place. I refer to it in my book as the quantum amusement park, because three of the key principles, and again, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a mathematician, and anytime I quote something scientific about quantum in my book, I footnote it, okay? And the footnote is quoting a scientist who has a PhD and knows what they're, so the thing about quantum theory, as I mentioned, is when we look at some of the principles of quantum theory and some of the principles of dream work and the creative unconscious of the human mind, there's a great affinity. But most people want certainty. One of the key principles of the quantum world is the theory of the uncertainty principle. Okay. All we can do is project probabilities. Nothing is certain. And we need a certain amount of certainty in our life, right? I mean, I want to be certain that when I get back to my home, the roof's still on. Okay, I get that. But our educational system is based on, if something isn't certain, then you're going to get nervous about it. Well, then get ready for a nervous breakdown, because where we are right now, things are moving so fast. Change is happening so fast. It's happened before in human evolution. We now know that evolution does not go in a steady rising pace. It basically goes kind of flatline for a long time, and then there is a huge leap. Those leaps we look back upon and say, wow, that was great. Look what happened in 5th century Greece with all the Platonic dialogues and Socrates and philosophy and democracy flourishing. And the Tao Ching being written, and the Buddha going around giving his incredible insights, right? This has happened before. How about the Italian Renaissance? Took place during the Black Plague, which was on its way to killing a third of Europe, rich and poor alike, and they didn't know what the cause was. And that induced them to create a Renaissance at a time when less than 1% of citizens were even literate, okay? So we have a lot of anxiety in our world. We sometimes have too much information, but the fact is, we've done this before. We've been in these kind of evolutionary leap periods before. Of course, they're anxiety inducing. Change in the dream world. This comes from my main teacher, Dr. Jeremy Taylor, who was a co-founder of the International Association for the Study of Dreams and taught dream work around the world for 50 years and was a real spiritual guy. But he knew his dreams. And he said all dreams come in the service of health and wholeness, particularly the nightmares. And I can tell a story about that. It is often the nightmare that gives us the most information if we're willing to look at it. And when we look at human evolution in the dream world, the most powerful image or experience in the dream world that represents a significant change is death. When something dies in our dream, that's our inner consciousness telling us we're now capable of making a huge change. Because what is change? What is a renaissance? Renaissance means rebirth, right? Well, how can something be reborn if what was holding it back doesn't die off? Okay. So, in order for there to be a huge change, there needs to be the death, not literal, but metaphorically, of whatever ways of thinking were holding it back. In the Italian Renaissance, for 1,000 years, it was the church that and the royal families that dictated what you were allowed to say in public and what you were allowed to think in public. And if you went against them, you were either excommunicated or executed. Okay. And so I understand that there are people correctly worried that the owners of Microsoft and the owners of Meta, Facebook, and the former Twitter, now X, those people have too much power. They don't have. Yes, they do have too much power, and their motives are not, always in our best interest. That's true, but they don't have as much power as the Catholic Church had during the Middle Ages and the kings and queens had during the Middle Ages, and yet we still got an Italian Renaissance, which shifted from that. So we've been through this before with less technology, with less information. It doesn't make it easy, but it makes it more understandable that yes, things are confusing, things feel apocalyptic, it feels like everything's falling apart, because a lot of the things that need to fall apart, namely the way we think about our relationship to nature and to the planet, they do have to die out. That's how you get a renaissance. And what we hope is that it's less violent and more people coming to an understanding, as I think a lot of young people are, that the way we've been living for the past few hundred years isn't working anymore. It can't be about getting more and more stuff to make us feel better. We need a certain amount. We need enough food. We need enough water. We need a good roof over our head. We need a good vehicle. We like nice things in life. But we need a much deeper connection between what it means to be a human in the 21st century, and that we are not separate from nature. We are embedded and part of nature. And we were given the gift of the right hemisphere of our brain, which gives us the potential. It's not about being academic or intellectual. It's about being in tune with nature's patterns of which we are a part. And we're all capable of doing that when we pay more attention to our dreams, when we do thought experiments, when we take the time to sit and just contemplate what's going on without trying to solve everything right away, with becoming more understanding of our nervous system. I mean, every day I have to check and go, why am I so angry about this? These are things we can all do, and we're proving it now because we're having this conversation over the World Wide Web. Over 5 billion of our brains are connected through this medium. No wonder it's chaotic. No wonder it's noisy. But underneath the noise and underneath the chaos, when we take the time to go underneath all that noise, what do we have? We have all of humanity's wisdom and knowledge at our fingertips, right? Through our search engines and through our websites. We have people talking to each other in ways they couldn't talk before. Programs like podcasts, like the Ethereal Edge, blogs, emails, web magazines, digital magazines. Underneath the 24/7 news cycle of chaos and anxiety, people like us are having these kinds of conversations. And the more this happens, the more things self-organize, and eventually what emerges is a renaissance. And people go, how'd that happen? Because of conversations that we're having, because of our being willing to look at what does it mean to be deeply human in the 21st century.
Yeah, and I think these concepts are in the ether now. So people who were never exposed to this before are becoming more aware and hearing more of this, where it wasn't even in their awareness, but now it's coming to the light a little bit more, where people are starting to discuss it in groups and, like you mentioned, on the web, through podcasts. And in relation to what you referenced for the Renaissance, and the way I relate to that is I look at it as it's what's in the subconscious, which is our unconscious behavior patterns. And we need to shed the light of awareness on those patterns. Like you were just saying, why am I so angry? Asking ourselves these dark questions of why do I have this behavior, and really trying to figure out where did that come from to change that pattern. Because once you actually become aware of these things, that's when it can dissipate and you can kind of integrate it back into your system, and you no longer have to struggle against it. Because whatever what is it, the phrase, if you resist it, it persists, right? So it's if you push against it, you're only reinforcing it versus actually letting it dissipate. And I know you also talked, Doug, about, and you mentioned earlier, the left side and the right side of the brain. And I know the right side is our creative side and the left side is more the analytical side of things. Can you share a little bit more about how those work together and what can we do? Are there any tools? Are there any any type of tips that you can share with anyone listening? I always love practical exercises or something we can put into play that will help integrate all of this information for us.
Sure. In my book, I have a number of thought experiments. If they were good enough for Einstein, they're good enough for us. And a thought experiment doesn't require a huge IQ. It requires more of an emotional intelligence and what I would call a spiritual or inner intelligence. Okay. So here's an example I have in my book, and I'll do it very simply. For 5 seconds, okay, visualize a tree, any kind of tree you want. Okay, now for 5 seconds, notice 3 details about that tree. Okay, now by noticing the tree and picking out 3 details, we learn more about the tree. And this is how our educational system has been set up. This is left hemisphere thinking. The left hemisphere of our brain is wired to gather facts and put them together in a way that we can understand clearly. Analysis, very important. One of the reasons we have science. One of the reasons we're the most powerful creatures on the planet. Okay, but we have to understand its limitations. Now, let's go back to that tree and visualize it and just take in the image all at once. Now, of course, we could do this for minutes or hours, but so when we took it in all at once, and then we had to explain to somebody about our tree, which of those 2 methods would give us a better chance of describing the tree to somebody else? The one where we picked out 3 characteristics, or the one where we took it all at once? The answer is the first one, because the left hemisphere is the verbal part of our brain where we get to explain things and talk things, which is very valuable. But guess what? When we took it in all at once, we switched to the right hemisphere of our brain, which geographically is and physically is larger than the left and is more intricately wired. Why did evolution do that? Because when we take it all in, we get a deeper sense of that tree. Even if we can't explain it in words, intuitively, we have more of a connection to it. When we're analyzing it, we can learn a lot about it, but we consider ourselves separate from it, right? We're analyzing it as opposed to kind of merging with it. Now, let's continue this abbreviated form of the thought experiment because we're not done. Now, imagine you're standing on the ground looking at your tree, but you now have the ability to raise your vision like a drone up to the top of the tree and see what's all around your tree. And now bring your vision back down and land it back down on the ground. Okay, now we're doing this quickly, but you'll get my point. When we stand on the ground and we analyze our tree, we gain a lot of information, but we literally can't see the forest for the trees. When we raise our vision above and we get to see what's around our tree, we now have a bigger picture of the context that our tree exists in, because our tree is not separate from its environment. It's connected to what's around it. But our entire educational system and our Western cultures for hundreds of years have prioritized analyzing things so that we can learn more about them and talk more clearly about them and do more things with them, all of which have advantages. But we're missing the forest for the trees. One more part of the experiment. Okay. And by the way, you say, well, wait a minute, that's too science fiction. We can't really raise our vision above the tree. Oh, yes, we can. That's what we call visionaries, right? People who
It's like remote viewing.
Yeah, right. But even on a simple level, it's people who can intuit what's going on and give us a deeper feel than the people who are analyzing it, right? We need both. Okay. But nature gave us a larger right hemisphere for intuition and for seeing the bigger picture and for getting a bigger context. One more part to the experiment, my favorite part. Now imagine you're standing in front of the tree and you have the ability to descend your vision underneath the ground, and that you can see the roots of your tree absorbing the nutrients, all the detritus from the dead leaves and the dead animals in the ground, that it is propelling up through the roots into the trunk of the tree to give life to your tree. Because we know the reason a tree is able to exist is because it's able to pull nutrients from the ground. Okay. That's an analogy to our unconscious. Our unconscious is where most of the real creative, life giving information and nutrients come from. Okay. They're not just physical nutrients, they're emotional, they're spiritual. And it's what really makes us human. And yet, think about it. In our entire educational system, how much time was spent on the bigger picture? How much time was spent on the unconscious? It's our job to learn this because it really is a much deeper sense of who we are and the gift that we were given. And you don't have to spend 4 years getting a degree in psychology in order to do this. It's available to all of us with thought experiments, creative visualizations, contemplation, forms of meditation, listening to somebody instead of trying to figure out what you're going to say next. These are all abilities that are going to become more and more important as the anxiety levels ratchet up. And the only thing I'm fairly certain about is the anxiety levels are going to ratchet up. Why? Because I think evolution has put us in one of those situations where we're being required to make an evolutionary leap in consciousness. And it's our responsibility in any way that we can do it, by doing something nice for a neighbor, whatever. It can be a small thing, but it all adds to how do we deal with the time when change is happening at a rate faster than ever before in evolution. And so we're going to have to really both speed up our brains to collaborate on the web and slow them down when we sit in contemplation or have an intimate conversation with a lover or a family member or a friend or an associate. It is definitely an anxious time. It's a complex time, but boy, is it an exciting time.
It is.
It is.
And I just love that exercise that you just shared, because I've never thought to go under the soil, like under the ground, because I have a tree and she has a name. Her name's Penny the Palm. I planted her. She's my baby. She's out on my patio, and I bought her as a baby, and she's gotten so big, and I talked to her, but I've never thought to like look under the soil to see how she's doing. And I just did that in my mind. And I was like, oh, wow, I never thought to do that. But also, Doug, you just answered a lifelong question for me, because growing up, I played softball as a little young tot, and they always would say, be the ball. And I never understood it. I mean, you're saying this to a child. You're not explaining what that means. I get it now, just from you explaining that and describing what that means. I'm like, oh, if somebody explained that to me when I was a kid, I probably would have understood it better and actually probably hit the ball.
Yeah, and we're into this incredible distinction between left and right hemisphere of the brain. And I want to just pay tribute to the man who taught me and many others most about this, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who wrote a brilliant book called The Master and His Emissary, and then a follow-up, The Matter with Things. And he's an example of why I'm optimistic. you see, for all the craziness going on and all of the really nasty behavior going on around the world, well, that's been true ever since human beings showed up on the planet. And quite frankly, it was true before we showed up on the planet, right? There's plenty of violence among other animal, creatures as well. But the fact of the matter is, and this was the most important thing that I learned in my writing the book, The Quantum and the Dream, because I love to learn. And I knew the first section of my book was going to be about the shift in consciousness from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere, which I thank you for giving us a chance to talk about. Be the ball is a right hemisphere thing. It can't be understood analytically. It can't be figured out. It needs to be absorbed, and then at some point you get it. That's right hemisphere. It doesn't come in stages like left hemisphere. Okay. The second section I knew was going to be about the shift from the printed page to the digital screen. Now, I still love to read books. Books aren't going away. But what I was able to do in the second section through Marshall McLuhan, through Kevin Kelly, who's one of the most modern examples of what McLuhan was talking about, and a few others, people who have a real visionary understanding of the World Wide Web. The fact of the matter is that if we adapt to it properly, we're still going to love to read. It's more contemplative, but the World Wide Web gives us the ability to make connections and new ideas much greater capacity. Can I give a quick example? It's one of my favorite examples that I came up with for my book, and it's another thought experiment. Okay. So let's say Tara, Tracy, and you, the three of us, and all of your listeners and viewers made a decision. We're a group, and we decided we wanted to learn more about Saturn's rings, but we've never been to a library before. We've heard about them, we've never been. So off we go as a group into a library, and one of us is a spokesperson, and we ask, how do we find out more about Saturn's rings? The librarian's going to smile and say, very easy. Go to the science section. And under the science section, find the astronomy section. And under the astronomy section, you'll find books on Saturn. And in those books, you'll find out about Saturn's rings. That's a perfect example of the left hemisphere thinking. It's the Dewey Decimal System we learned about in school. It works beautifully for a physical book library. Congratulations. Now we ramp up the thought experiment. We're the same group, right? And one of us comes up with this crazy idea. I'm curious. I wonder if there have ever been advertising campaigns based on the Buddha. So now we go back to our librarian, all optimistic, right? We got to Saturn's rings easily, and we asked the librarian, could you direct us to the section that could tell us whether there have been on Buddhist advertising campaigns? Well, you're going to get a rather confused look from the librarian. And the best the librarian could say is, well, if you go to our religious section, within there's a Buddhist section. There were books on Buddhism, but you're going to have to go to the index and see if they mention advertising. It's going to take a long time. And what are the odds we're going to find something? Not very good. So the left hemisphere Dewey Decimal System, which was brilliant at getting us to Saturn's rings, is not going to get us to a Buddhist. Maybe there never has been one. As I was thinking up this experiment, I put into my search engine Buddhist advertising campaigns. In 5 seconds, I was led to a website about a product called the Thirsty Buddha, which is a sugarless soda, right, that uses Buddhist language to promote it. I mean, I couldn't believe it. 5 seconds. So what does this have to do with the new Renaissance? Okay. We need to come up with new ways of thinking about things. We need to come up with deeper ways of connecting with nature and the planet as a whole. The World Wide Web, with the search engines and with its able to link articles through hypertext, is actually, and I quote scientists in my book, the process of what I just did with a search engine to find out about Buddhist advertising is closer to the way we generate new ideas in our brain than is the printed page. So we're still going to love to read books, but we need to take advantage of this incredible new medium, which allows us to connect not only with each other, but with new ideas and new ways of thinking things that people are already doing in ways that couldn't have been imagined 100 years ago. And here we are using them. So to me, that's just one example of left hemisphere, right hemisphere. We need them both, but we're going to have to shift much more to the right hemisphere to take advantage of the digital screen and its collaborative abilities. But then the third section of my book, I didn't know how it was going to end. And I'll give the shortened version because it's really about a shift from the age of information to the age of recognition. And what I am suggesting we need to recognize is the deeper meaning of evolution. And the person who I was led to, it took me a long time to understand her because she writes mostly technically in chemistry and biology. Her name is Lynn Margulis. She married the great astronomer Carl Sagan when she was a teenager. They divorced, but they had a son who she collaborated with the rest of her life. During the 60s, she got her PhD in biology at a time, even in the revolutionary 60s, when being a woman going for a PhD in science, you bumped up against the patriarchy, right? And she said, I love men, but I'm not going to take crap from any of them. She developed the nickname, the Unruly Earth Mother. She's the co-author of the Gaia theory, which I go into in my book. We don't have time to go into now, but it's a beautiful theory about understanding the Earth as a whole living system. And here's what Lynn Margulis proved. She proved that while Darwin was a genius, his view of evolution was limited to natural selection and kind of competition. She was able to prove, and I go into the details in my book, all footnoted because others have corroborated her insights, that underneath the predator-prey competition of nature, which we see all the time, right? There is a deeper pattern that started with microbes millions of years ago before there were any plants or insects. And evolution has shown a deep pattern of pushing towards newer, more complex forms of collaboration. That's the reason we're here. Yes, there's competition, but if all we were doing was competing, we would have been gone by now. We are here because of evolutionary and nature's intelligence pushing life towards newer and more complex forms of collaboration. This has been proved scientifically. It's still under the surface because most science is left hemisphere and whatever, but you can seek it out. And to me, this was a mind blower because if we go deep enough into the World Wide Web, we're going to find people collaborating. We're going to find new forms of collaboration, but they're not at the surface. The surface is lots of noise, lots of competition, lots of eat or be eaten, and what's called the zero-sum game. In order for one person to win, another person has to lose, which is how the stock market works. That only works up to a point, and we've reached a point where it's not working anymore. Welcome to global warming and climate change. And even the most advanced computers can't predict the apocalyptic nature of what we've caused by grabbing so much material things out of nature without any recourse for balance. I think we're going to figure it out, but it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be a Hallmark card version, but no Renaissance is a Hallmark card cliche. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of understanding, and it takes a lot of empathy. And here's what Ian McGilchrist showed with, and by the way, his book has over 1,500 footnotes, scientific footnotes, and that is that at its core, nature is collaborative, and it's given us a right hemisphere of the brain, which is where we're wired for empathy. The left hemisphere of our brain is incredibly intelligent. It's great at analyzing things. It's great at breaking things down into smaller parts and understanding them mechanistically, but it isn't empathic. The left hemisphere of our brain does not share. It's the right hemisphere of our brain, which is physically larger and wired in a much more complex way, which gives us the ability to be empathic, not just to our family members or our neighbors, but to other people we don't even know. And if we didn't have that ability, we wouldn't have agriculture, we wouldn't have towns, we wouldn't have cities. And we're going to have to accelerate that part of our thinking and understanding if we're going to thrive during the next 50 years, which we're going to see changes that we can't even predict.
Absolutely. And I think there's just so much to talk about here, Doug. You've touched upon quite a few subjects that we could probably do a deep dive on each one. And just out of respect for your time today, we just want to say thank you for everything that you shared. And I think your book is a wealth of knowledge. So I definitely appreciate you talking with us about it. And for anyone who's listening, The Quantum and the Dream, Visionary Consciousness, AI and the New Renaissance, you should definitely check it out. There's a lot of great information in here. And Doug, can you share with anybody listening, where can they find your book?
Sure. It's on Amazon. It can be ordered through any bookstore. My website, douglasgrunther.com, is a landing page for the book. So they can put Quantum and Dream, Douglas Grunther. You can get to my website or go right to Amazon or go to your favorite bookstore and order it. And I appreciate the time here. You folks are doing a great job. You're the reason I'm optimistic, is because these kinds of conversations are happening all over the world. It's under the 24/7 news cycle, right? But it's happening at an unconscious as well as a conscious level. So I remain optimistic. And Tracy, if you want to email me your recurring dream, I'd be happy to work that with you. My thank you for being on this podcast, because our dreams come in the service of health and wholeness, and I have very good examples of that in my book as well.
I would love that.
Thank you so much for the time.
Absolutely. That is such a kind offer, Doug. We appreciate it. This has been such a fun conversation for us. We love discussing these types of topics, and we just appreciate you sharing about your book and your understandings and all of your knowledge that you shared with us. So thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Continued success with the Ethereal Edge.